one small voice singing peace on earth. Lord, how long will it take? In 1932, a group calling itself the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation, under the auspices of the League of Nations, approached the physicist Albert Einstein, considered, of course, the greatest genius of his generation, maybe of all generations, with an intriguing proposition. They said, Einstein, why don't you reach out to another public thinker, someone that you view as being brilliant, and engage them on a question of your choosing to have a frank exchange of opinions on this very weighty matter. And then we will publish the results to the edification of the general public. Well, Einstein liked this idea, so he agreed to it, and he decided that he would reach out to one Sigmund Freud, then rather well known for his pioneering work on psychiatry and psychoanalysis. Freud had discovered or uncovered the role of the subconscious in human life. Before Freud, the very definition of the human being was that man, capital M, man, was the rational animal, to which Freud said, hang on a minute. Now, there are a lot of questions that I would like to ask Freud given the chance, like, what was your problem with women exactly? And what's with the cigars, really? And Freud went into the discussion, he agreed to this, and he was sort of anticipating that Einstein was going to ask him something about maybe the overlap of experimental psychology with physics, you know, and the mechanical physics versus the human brain, or something like that, some kind of heady psychophysical question. And Einstein's question was pretty different. He asked Freud, is there any way of delivering mankind, capital M, from the menace of war? That was the question he had for Freud in 1932. Is there any way of delivering mankind from the menace of war? It is common knowledge, Einstein wrote, that with the advance of modern science, this issue has come to mean a matter of life and death for civilization as we know it. Nonetheless, for all the zeal displayed, every attempt at its solution has ended in a lamentable breakdown. Now, Einstein, of course, was writing in the aftermath of the First World War, the most brutal and violent conflagration of war in recent human memory, claimed some 20 million lives. And he was writing in the shadow of a renewed German militarism, the collapse of the Western economies, and the rise to power of Adolf Hitler. So at that time that he was writing, a Second World War was at the same time completely unthinkable and all too frightening a reality. But of course, not even the darkest, most pessimistic imagination could have foreseen the horrors that that war and that Nazism would unleash on the world. But Einstein at that time was urging Freud to use his understanding of the instinctive life to curb what he saw as a latent lust for hatred and destruction, in his words, buried inside the heart of humanity. In his response, Freud first protested that he had no knowledge of politics, and he thought perhaps this was really a political question, and he was not an expert. But he would weigh in on the instinctive life of humanity. And he said, you know, really there are two impulses going on at the same time. He agreed that there is a violent and destructive tendency, which he called the aggressive instinct. But he said there is also a conserving and creative impulse, which he called the erotic instinct, from the Greek word eros, meaning the god of love. And Freud said that these tendencies, destructive and conserving, are co-equally intermingled in all human acts. They drive all of human life, and you kind of need and have both of them, and you're going to have both of them. They're not ineradicable, and they're needed. He said, for example, the instinct to self-preservation is a conserving instinct, but it also potentially involves aggression, and so on with so many human acts. And so the question is, what are we to do with these impulses buried within us? Well, Freud's depiction of the human subconscious called to my mind anyway, a famous image of the human soul that we have from the philosopher Plato, which is found in the Socratic dialogue called Phaedrus. And in this dialogue, Plato likens the human soul to a chariot that's been yoked to two winged horses. And one of these horses is a beautiful and noble animal and kind of represents the yearning towards a vision that is full of goodness and beauty. And one of these animals is ignoble and very unruly and wild, and it represents an urging towards pleasure, the material world, immediate gratification, things of that nature. And the charioteer represents the human reason, which has been yoked to these two powerful animal drives and is kind of, pulled this way and that, sort of struggling to rein them in. And Plato says the driving of them of necessity gives a great deal of trouble to him. But in this extended metaphor, the idea is that the human charioteer yoked to these horses is attempting to ascend into heaven. He wants to follow the gods. The gods have only divine horses, so their winged chariots go straight up, no problem whatsoever. And at the height of this ascent, the gods can see true reality, beauty, truth, goodness, love, as they really exist in their spiritual form, and they get to dwell there with all these wonderful things. And that's what humans want to do. So we get in our chariot and we ascend with our horses, but we can't control them very well. And one of them is noble and one of them is not, and so they're always pulling in different directions. And so we don't get that same vision of uncorrupted pure truth. It's always obscured by the desires of our body or our immediate appetites, and these horses are always pulling us down before we can reach the height of our ascent. And inevitably, we will sink back to the earth. And of this moment, Plato says, there is confusion and perspiration and the extremity of effort, and many of the animals are lamed or have their wings broken through the ill driving of the charioteers. Which sounds like me trying to parallel park in Broad Ripple, but that is a different story. However, and this is the interesting part, the vision of beauty and truth, however briefly seen at the height of that ascent, however briefly seen, Plato says that vision is not lost. It imprints itself on the soul. The soul, when it returns from that vision of pure truth, carries it with him or her. And then when the person dies, they carry this knowledge into the next life. They reincarnate. Plato believed in the reincarnation of the soul, or sometimes he did anyway. And you carry this knowledge with you, and then you can sort of reincarnate into a higher form. And he has a little bit of fun with this, like if he ranks everyone. If you've got this much knowledge, then you're like an economist. If you've got more knowledge, then you're like a statesman. If you've got the most knowledge, you're a philosopher. I'm sure he picked that at random. And so on. But over the course of thousands of years, the idea is that you might cycle through so much truth and beauty that you could eventually sort of ascend directly into the heavenly realm. This was his vision of a spiritual development over time and over many lives. And so Plato sees the human condition of one of being yoked to these powerful psychic impulses, one to soar and one to sink, one inclined to higher pursuits and one to base pleasures. And he identifies the reasoning faculty, as the means by which these impulses are brought under control. Now, this reminded me, as I go through these chains of reminding me of, our Unitarian tradition, because as we mentioned in a sermon I gave a couple weeks ago about school being in session, our Unitarian tradition also emphasizes spiritual development, not over many lives, but over this life, as a process by which our reason learns to govern our appetites or our base impulses. The great Unitarian minister William Ellery Channing said, "I call that mind free which masters the senses, which passes life not in asking what it shall eat or drink, base impulses, but by hungering, thirsting, and seeking after righteousness, truth, beauty, love, all that good stuff." And in another sermon, Likeness to God, about this ascent to a higher being, he says, we approach our Creator by every right exertion of the powers that he gives us, meaning our reason and our choice. And he says, whenever we invigorate the understanding by seeking truth, whenever we invigorate the conscience by following it in opposition to the passions, again, base desires, whenever we war against a habit or desire whenever we think, speak, or act with moral energy and devotion to duty, then he says that divinity is growing within us and we are ascending towards our author. So that is Channing's vision of spiritual development, a process by which our reason and our ability to choose allow us to ascend ever closer to God. Now, in his day, many strands of Christianity would have emphasized the exact opposite. They would have said that it is impossible for humanity to become good through the use of the reason or the use of the will. The reason is fatally corrupt. The will is mired in sin. We are simply too flawed for that. We can't get there on our own at all. But the Unitarians did not accept that rather crabbed vision of the human spirit. They said, our human dignity, our everlasting glory, lies in our ability to discern the good and then choose the good. And Channing would have said, with Jesus as our example, we can do just that. We can discern the good and choose the good, and this is the essence of human freedom. Or as the poet said, it matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. That humanity would, in fact, use its freedom to choose the good seemed practically a foregone conclusion to the Unitarians, who were extremely optimistic about the power of education and science and democratic institutions to unleash the full flowering of human potential. These impulses to which we normally give the name evil, violence, destructiveness, prejudice, hatred, greed, these were social maladjustments. They were caused by problems in the social environment, and they could be addressed by addressing that social environment. By the 1880s, the Unitarian minister James Freeman Clarke had as one of the 5 tenets of liberal religion the belief, as he said, in the progress of humankind onward and upward forever. That is optimism. The progress of humankind onward and upward forever. And by the turn of the 20th century, this kind of optimistic spirit had spread very widely throughout mainstream Christianity and secular democracies in general, onward and upward forever. And then came the 2 world wars, and the unspeakable horror of the Holocaust, and the detonation of the atomic bombs. And this was a shattering refutation to the liberal ideal that educated, wealthy, scientific, cultured societies would not do these things. Educated, cultured, scientific, wealthy societies would necessarily choose the path of goodness and peace if it was laid out to them rationally. But in the light of 20th century history, the automatic assurance of progress seemed like a cruel joke. In the end, the destructive impulse of Freud, the wild steed of Plato, had proved too strong an impulse for the reason to master. Einstein, writing to Freud in 1932, had been all too prescient when he said, "Man has within him a lust for hatred and destruction, and it is a comparatively easy task to call it into play and raise it to the power of a collective psychosis." Now, in the aftermath of these wars, some theologians, Reinhold Niebuhr would be one, began to take their fellow religionists in Europe and America to task for being very overly naive about the human capacity for evil, and very overly confident about the power of reason to guide those wild steeds. They'd been preaching rainbows and sunshine as though they had forgotten that storm clouds also are a fact of nature. And so they had not prepared their congregants for the real challenges that they would face, the challenges within their own soul in dealing with the challenges in their society. And they were caught unawares and overconfident. So there was a story the other day in the news that caught my attention. It's a small thing, but it seems to encapsulate a lot of big things. There was a man walking on the streets of New York City, and he passed by a woman who was wearing the traditional garb of her Muslim faith. And as he walked past her, he took out his lighter and he lit her clothing on fire. And then he disappeared into the crowd. And luckily, someone saw that fire and alerted the woman, and she put it out before it did anything more than burn a hole in her clothing. She was not physically harmed, although one can imagine the harm to her emotional well-being and her sense of security. There is something happening in our country that is dark. There is terrible violence in the world, of course, perpetrated by groups like ISIS, mostly perpetrated against Muslims, mostly perpetrated in distant lands, but it is having its echo here at home as well, increasing the level of anxiety and fear and even paranoia that we see in our fellow citizens. And frightened people behave badly. Frightened people are extremely susceptible to the appeal of the strong man, the demagogue, the tough leader who promises safety if only strong measures are taken against those people, whoever those people are at this particular time in history. And this election, with its naked appeals to xenophobia and racism and Islamophobia, seem to be energizing those dark undercurrents of the American psyche and seem to be mobilizing them. And the demands of Black Americans and LGBT Americans for civil rights and fair treatment is provoking a powerful backlash in some quarters that is also feeding on that sense of paranoia and isolation. And at the same time, the language of political discourse is becoming violent in a way that used to be totally out of bounds for mainstream politicians. Totally out of bounds. There was a governor of Kentucky who gave a speech that if Hillary Clinton were elected president, he worried that the Tree of Liberty would have to be watered with the blood of his children, is how he put it, in overthrowing tyranny. And there are spillover effects from this general violent language, violent emotions, violent fear. A woman with short hair is assaulted leaving a public restroom because a man suspects that if she has short hair, she might be a transgender woman, and so he physically accosts her. I've heard that story a number of times. That's not an isolated incident. That's happened several times. Or a high school basketball team is taunted with racist slurs and chants to build the wall, build the wall. And these stories say so much about these storm clouds that are gathering in our country, and these stories are becoming more and more common. So to all of us who are committed to human rights and the protection of human dignity, this is a time when we are called to be especially engaged as citizens and as people. And I would ask that no one think it can't happen here. Oh, it can't happen here. Our religious tradition and our shared covenant challenge us to be courageous in the face of bullies, to stand up and call out injustice, and to be in solidarity with those who have been singled out for political threats and actual threats. And this is a time when we are called to do that. And I ask us not to be cocooned in our sense that the charioteer is in charge of the chariot. That reason will prevail, and that, oh no, it can't happen here. Now, there was a book published a few years back by Steven Pinker. He's a cognitive scientist, and it's called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And it says we have reason to be optimistic as people. Certainly we have reason for our Unitarian optimism. Pinker amasses a mountain of statistics and data looking at the entire sweep of human history, and he makes a really persuasive case that the trajectory of human history really is moving onward and upward. Even when you take into account the history of the 20th century, and he says, I know the history of the 20th century seems like it must be the worst century in all of human history, but actually it's not even close. The past is much more violent than we give it credit for. And he amasses all this data, and he says that across all boards, war, civil war, violence perpetrated by governments, violence in people's daily lives, the level of violence has been ticking lower century by century by century. And we still see that today. And he credits this to the spread of liberal ideas and liberal institutions across centuries of human effort. Not just one isolated act, but the whole sweep of people pushing the ball forward, advocating for human rights, securing legal protections for those rights, expanding abstract concepts like human rights and dignity. right? And he credits institutions like the United Nations and these mechanisms that we put in place to provide alternatives to violence. It's an important book, and I recommend reading it. You might skip over the chapters where he talks about how violent the past was. It was violent. Trust me on that. You don't have to read the details if you don't want to. But he makes the case that liberalism works. And by liberalism, I don't mean like liberal Democrat, but I mean classical liberalism. Norms like universal education, civil rights, equal protection under the law, democracy, international cooperation. These ideas are consistent with our UU principles. They're transformative ideas, and as they spread, they lower the level of violence. So I want to hold up that classic Unitarian optimism today. There is a reason that we have that optimistic tradition, because our ideas work. Now, to Einstein's question, what can be done to deliver mankind from the menace of war? Freud answered a little bit differently. He said that cultural development was our best hope of taming the aggressive impulse. And he was writing again in between those two wars, but he was hesitantly optimistic, that in the long run the human soul could be civilized through culture. And he doesn't see this as individuals necessarily like utilizing their ability to reason. He sees it a little bit more like the domestication of an animal. He even uses that metaphor. Humans can sort of be domesticated through this constant process of acculturation that would basically make acts of violence, he doesn't quite say this, but kind of like it would be sort of tacky. We're all going to become really civilized. We're going to lose our taste for violence, is almost the way that Freud put it. But our Unitarian vision is a little bit different, and I want to hold it up for us today. We still incline to Plato's vision of the chariot. At the end of the day, you remember how the charioteer rises to that vision of truth and beauty, and even though it must inevitably sink back down, that beauty is imprinted on the soul. The beauty is imprinted on the soul. Well, as Unitarian Universalists, we actually have two founts of optimism for us. One of them is reason and the spread of those institutions that Steven Pinker is telling us are improving the world in the long run. The other one is in the power of love. We believe in the power of love to leave its imprint on the souls of those who encounter it, however you understand that language. We believe in the power of love to leave its resonance singing in our own soul when we hear its chords. And we believe that our own acts of love can be a vision to our fellows. And so we are each empowered to lift up our culture. And this is our hope, our great hope and optimism for the short run as well. Because long term, we're counting on reason and these institutions. But right here in the moment where the action is happening, we can each be a vision of love to one another. And our Universalist faith tells us that we don't need to be anyone special to do this. We don't need to be brilliant. We don't need to be perfect. We don't need to lose 10 pounds. We don't need to get a raise. Any of that. Just as we are, just as we rolled out of bed in the morning, we are empowered to be a vessel of love for the world and to be a vision of love for our fellows. And so, just as love imprints on the soul, the love that we share in the world is imprinting on the soul of those around us. We believe in the power of reason to open minds, and we believe in the power of love to open hearts. And in this way, we are each able to be that small difference in the world that the choir was singing so beautifully about. So in these dark times, under these storm clouds that are gathering, I invite each of you, I invite each of us not to underestimate our ability to be that small difference in the world, not to underestimate our ability to shine the light of love wheresoever we can. And in so doing, make a change, open a heart, make a difference. Lord, how long will it take? Let it begin today with us. May it be so.